Hello again. Hello. We can talk a little more about Zelda, I think, and see where we take it from there. So, Zelda. There are many things to talk about Zelda. We have this fact of Link's relationship to the different female characters he meets and what that could mean both symbolically and literally, because I think the game is taking it in a very symbolic direction somehow. Right? It's depicting all these real things, real encounters between people, and yet these real encounters seem to be slowly transforming into something symbolic. It's almost like they're slowly evaporating into steam as the game goes on and then transforms into adulthood. I think it's interesting because I kind of feel this with Saria. Saria seems like a very down-to-earth relationship between Link and Saria. Right? It's very, let's say, like traditionally realistic situation, right? It's two people who live in the same village, and they've met because they live in this place, and sort of some sort of it feels as some sort of an emotional bond has been created or is felt from Saria's perspective, right? It feels like let's say it's not. I'm not interested in whether this is or isn't realistic or typical or traditional. I just mean that I think the game is playing on that stereotype of a typical fairy tale situation where two people who are on the same kind of spectrum, the same kind of people, meet. Whereas, right, I'm trying to compare this to Ruto, which is a princess meeting a boy kind of situation, which is also typical of fairy tales, but is that other side of fairy tale logic where someone who belonged to a completely different world, the Kokiri world, meets someone from a world that feels sort of mystical or enchanted from his perspective. Right? I feel like the game is going for that sort of aesthetic of the Kokiri feels like a slightly like down to earth, it's earthy place, right? People wear these sort of like cloth and maybe plant made clothes, and then the Zoras and Ruto. Ruto herself seems to have like jewels embedded into her clothing, is a princess, right? The daughter of the king. You don't get a sense in the Kokiri town that there is a king. It doesn't feel like that sort of a structure. And so, in some ways, it makes it feel as if, okay, the sense I get is that there is some issue about wealth. That in the Zora place, there is some sort of wealth. There is like an aristocracy and a monarchy, right? There's a king, there's a princess, and there's like a sense of a greater amount of wealth. The king also has like a huge jewel on his crown and things like that. Jabu Jabu himself is studded with jewels as well. There is a sort of an aristocratic feeling, I think, to the Zora people. in comparison to the Kokiri people. I mean, I think that that's what the game is going for. It's the same sort of thing that you would draw from if you're making fantasy and you're depicting like the elves as these sort of aristocratic figures and the hobbits as these sort of more kind of less wealthy, more whatever, down to earth kind of people. It feels like the same sort of duality anyway. Okay. So, where to go from there? We're talking then about some sort of a transition, I feel, between a world, the Kokiri world, that seems to have no kind of hierarchy of wealth. It doesn't seem that way to begin with. And then a world that does seem to have that sort of a hierarchy of wealth, with jewels and things like that, precious stones. And so it's the same kind of thing that happens in Mario, in a sense. And I mentioned this because both games obviously belong to the same company, so I feel there is probably a tradition there of the sorts of things that this company is exploring. And of course, the kind of just general archetypal stories that you would encounter in myth and folklore and fairy tales and things like that these games are, I think, drinking from and belong to. These games are mythology, are folklore in some way. So the idea then is, so with Mario it's the same thing. It's this like someone who represents non-ownership of wealth, right? I think the contrast that is made between him being a plumber and Peach being a princess is, again, it's an archetypal contrast, the same kind of contrast you would find in fairy tales of the poor boy who falls in love with the rich princess. I feel like that's sort of some sort of an archetypal motif. It's interesting from the get-go because, of course, it places the princess as some sort of an elevated figure, like a mystical figure. Because being a princess in these games, both in Mario and in Zelda, and in fairy tales in general, I feel that like being a princess very often is associated to being mystical, to having some sort of spiritual power or being in contact with spirit in some special way, right? Princess Peach seems to have some sort of a connection to spirit in some way, I feel. Some sort of a power that is beyond the material. And I feel like Princess Zelda has that, and by extension, I feel like Ruto probably has that. Just by the fact of belonging to, to a world, the Zora world, where she's been granted this like jewel that has some sort of a magical power to it, right? She was granted this jewel by her mother, so she is like the caretaker of this jewel. There is something in this where the princess then is associated to some sort of a mystical figure, right? And then there's the poor boy, be it Mario or Link, would be some sort of like a material, non-mystical kind of person who slowly becomes mysticized over the course of their travels, right? They acquire powers. Mario acquires powers through, encountering different sorts of objects. Link also accumulates all these different spells and powers and magical things. And so ends at the end, like, I feel as if the closer that Link gets to Zelda, if the game is like a quest towards Zelda in some way, in the way that Mario's quest is a quest towards Peach, the closer that Link gets to Zelda, the more mystical he himself has become. The more of some sort of a wizard or a spiritual being he has become. He's become, the hero of time, some sort of mystical creature of some sort. So it feels like it's this sort of fusion, right, of like starting off as this sort of material being and getting closer to some sort of a divine epitome of spirituality that is like the princess in Link's eyes, and then getting closer to this figure and oneself, Link, becoming more and more spiritual. And of course, there's all this stuff there with the fact that union with this spiritual creature, called the princess, is a union that partakes of the cultural ideas of marriage, romantic relationship, sexual intimacy, and things like that, right? All of that stuff seems to be contained within what the game is referring to when it speaks of union. So, there is some idea, I feel, of sexual attraction in these games, right? That is not spoken, but I think it's not spoken purely because this is fairy tale territory. It's not. It's the kind of stuff that isn't even spoken in fairy tales. It isn't even spoken in mythology. I think in Nintendo it's even less spoken because I think there is a sort of a conscious effort to keep the games like free of anything that Nintendo would deem to be adult content. But there is, I feel, a sense of a context constantly of sexual attraction. And so that brings a whole thing into this game that is not, I don't think is ever like acknowledged by the game. Because I think it can't. It's not that it can't be. I think that it isn't by these sorts of stories. It's the idea of sexual orientation. It's not just sexual attraction. It's a sexual attraction that is oriented directly towards a series of behaviors and traits that are materialized by people who are not Link and who are, let's say, portraying a different gender role than him. So the idea of, that's what I find fascinating about this game, that I would like to explore more, but I'm finding it difficult to explore it, precisely because it feels so hidden in this game. But I feel like the idea of sexual orientation, and specifically heterosexuality, is like deeply in this game. Because again, what I think what draws Link towards these situations and towards Zelda is a sexual orientation that directs all of his desire towards behaviors that are different from the behaviors that he embodies. And he embodies, in some sort of like cultural studies sort of way, it's like he embodies masculinity, and then Zelda embodies femininity, and he's like, he's in heterosexuality. He's drawn towards that. So that's part of the story. Right? That's part of the story that is, let's say, the most literal part of the story, the least symbolic part of the story. But then the story is symbolic at the same time, of course. Because, as we were saying, it's almost as if the female gender role is equated to the mystical, to the spiritual, right? And that the male gender role is equated to the opposite of the spiritual, the opposite of the mystical, right? So it's like these gender roles are representing things that are completely beyond what human beings can be, right? And what human beings can embody. And yet, and yet it's like human beings are sort of striving for these archetypes in some way. And of course, the complicated thing then is that I feel as if Link, and I think people in general, are striving for both archetypes at the same time. If we were to call them two, if we were to focus and analyze the situation as a situation in which there has been a division of content that divides itself into the archetypal content of the spiritual or the feminine, and then the archetypal content of the masculine or the material, then both sides are being strived for by Link. Right? At least we could say that if Link starts off being the material and is striving towards the spiritual, then at the end he becomes the spiritual. Or he gets closer to it, let's say, right? The whole idea is that he's integrating it. Throughout his process, he is becoming more spiritual. He acquires all sorts of magical moves and skills that he didn't have as a little boy. He becomes... his materiality becomes charged with spirit. So, of course, that's the part of the game where the game becomes complicated, because it's, in some ways, it's pointing towards a situation that is present, obviously directly present in our world, where on the one hand we have these sorts of different behaviors that people do, and different traits that people have, and how sexuality seems to be oriented in these directions in different ways, right? And then it's sort of connecting that with the idea of those behaviors pointing towards archetypal realities. Yeah. The intersection between those two poles I find interesting. The intersection between the symbolic or archetypal world and the literal historical world, you could say. Yeah. It's fascinating too. I have a feeling, although I'm not sure, I feel as if the second half of the game, when Link is an adult, is slightly more about money. I'm not exactly sure how to describe this, or what is being pointed towards here. But I feel as if, as Link as an adult, doesn't he acquire medallions? That sort of what he's acquiring are not jewels like when he's a kid, but he's acquiring these medallions that, if I remember correctly, they have something to do with the Temple of Time and the sages and all that stuff. But they're sort of precious metals transformed into a disc with some sort of an image on them. It's a disc of precious metal with some sort of an engraving. I feel like that's a coin, like it's something that it'd be difficult not to associate with a coin. It's an object of great value that is also a precious metal and is also a circle and also has some sort of an engraving on it. As far as I remember, they're not used as coins. They're used to like wake up the ancient sages or something, but they are coins. So Link goes from acquiring precious stones to acquiring coins. You could say that Link is sort of like embodying the transition from precious materials in their raw state, just precious emerald, precious ruby, precious gold, silver. I think you could include these in the same sort of category. Precious materials that have not been worked into a specific shape and form. This is not true, because those precious stones are clearly worked, right? They are engraved into specific shapes. But I feel as if maybe the transition from precious stones to medallions is highlighting some sort of a transition from a slightly less worked material to a slightly more worked material, right? A precious stone feels like a kind of valuable object that we would associate more to the past of human history. And coins to a slightly more modern age of human history. I'm interested in how that sort of corresponds to Link being a child and Link being an adult. But so, okay, there is some way, maybe, in which we're transitioning from, again, some sort of an unworked state to a slightly more labored, worked state, where coins are the object of value. For adult Link, coins are the object of value. Precious jewels are like cuter, more associated to childhood, perhaps. Colourful. Medallions are sort of serious, it's money. It's something serious about it. And this transition, I feel, is even present in the way in which we transition from the dungeons to the temples. Very interesting as well, because the dungeons are also like base materials. They are slightly like unworked locations. Both the Deku Tree and Jabu Jabu are not, they're not like a cave that has been carved out into a specific shape. They're just, let's say, it's a fish. It's the inside of a fish and the inside of a tree. The inside of a tree maybe has been worked a little bit. There are doors here and there, but I feel like it, in comparison to the old Link temples, they're much more kind of left as it is. Adult Link dungeons, temples, the name already points towards something different, and you can see it when you enter them. They are worked, deeply worked. The temples are architecture. There are all sorts of columns and balconies and engravings on the wall, and it's built place. It's a constructed place. There's a feeling of it being like base material, rock, wood, whatever, carved out into a specific shape by the will of some sort of an some sort of a will, some sort of an agency has carved this out. Right? It's more of a building than the dungeons were. Even Dodongo's Cavern, again, yes, there is obviously architecture involved. There is architecture involved in all of the dungeons. But I feel it really is like there is a difference. It seems more rough somehow. There are more elements that have been just left to be as they are somehow. And the architecture is a little more just, I don't know, simpler, purely functional maybe. The temples are very, very intricate mazes of architecture. This obviously is perfect for the gameplay. It in a sense includes the gameplay within itself, because it is part of the gameplay. The temples are harder dungeons than the dungeons. So there is also an issue of the difficulty curve going up. Adult Link portion of the game is harder than childhood Link portion of the game. So there is a growing, in that sense, a growing towards difficulty. So the temples, I think, are like difficult places. But that difficulty then is, it transforms into complicated architecture. It requires complicated architecture in order to be difficult as a game. But of course, again, the effect that has is that it creates places that can't really be called caverns anymore. It's not a cavern, it's a temple. And the word temple is chosen, right? Which has a religious significance. The temple is the last place that childhood Link goes to as a child in the first half of the game. You go to the Temple of Time, transform into an adult, and then you only visit temples. So the Temple of Time is this transition between the caverns, the dungeons, and the temples. So time is maybe the primordial temple that we're talking about here. Anyway, so Link is visiting these temples, which are, again, places of... A temple is a place of worship, union with spirit. It's a place of union with spirit. So Link is visiting all these places of union with spirit that are difficult dungeons to complete. They are temples. Again, so there's this sort of whole transition towards spirit, towards union with spirit. It passes through temples and towards Zelda. And then the thing then, I wanted to tie it back down to coins, if I could, for a second, because I feel as if maybe, it's interesting, I feel as if maybe there is the same thing going on with the temples as with the coins. Again, you see, the coins are materials that have been worked into a specific shape. There is an architecture to the coin, there is a design, let's say, in the same way that the temples are, again, maybe caves or natural locations that have been worked into a specific design or architecture. So there is an interesting, if that is so, I feel like there is a very interesting connection that is being made between temples as complicated buildings and coins. I find this funny because it echoes so perfectly, I feel, the arrival of coins on the scene in human history itself. I feel like there seems to be a deep connection between the arrival of coins as a means of exchange that is slightly more universal, where the same kind of coins can be exchanged for all sorts of different things. And so there is a connection between that, the arrival of that mode of exchange, and temples, I think. I don't know what it is, but I feel like there is a connection between, right, in this case, Christianity and the arrival of coins. At least it's a parallelism that is often made, right? That the kind of that there is some metaphysical assumptions in the way that that Christianity emerges, and probably maybe not Christianity. I'm saying Christianity because I feel like this game is making some sort of reference to Christian folklore in some way, right? Churches, the Temple of Time is clearly a church. It's clearly a Christian church. It's a Christian style church. Zelda's palace is clearly the kind of a palace that you would find in a European Christian, city or something. So there's that, right? I feel like it's interesting. It feels as if the game is making some sort of connection between the complexification of caves, a cave and like an untouched environment being complexified into architecture, into a building, and in this case a temple, and the arrival of coins also as a base material that is turned into something more complicated. Okay, so let's go back to what we were saying before, because obviously the game is in some ways about this. It's about a poor boy who meets a rich girl. It is in some way about the transition from Link as a boy who exists in a world, again, without sort of hierarchies of wealth that would exist in Hyrule, for example. And he slowly becomes, he gets close enough to Zelda that he practically sort of unites with her world and her life. He is a part of her world, a part of her life. He becomes, I feel, he enters into the world of wealth. And it's a wealth that is associated to coins or money, because you can see that Hyrule, that's what happens in Hyrule Town. Hyrule Town is a place whose central area is a market, right? This is very different from the other locations you visit. Very different from Goron City, Kokiri, etc., etc. There is different kinds of trade in these different places, but Hyrule Town and Hyrule Castle are the only places I feel where there is a very obvious sort of structure where you have the marketplace and then the castle up in the background. You can see it's the classic sort of like medieval pyramidal scheme where you can see the lord reigning over the town and then the town sort of descending down into the peasants, the workers in the market, working all of these, all of their produce and selling it and things like that. So that's kind of weird. It's creepy in some ways. That there is a transition from no coins to coins. Link starts off someone without coins, let's say, and becomes someone who has coins. The same thing happens to Mario, in a sense, right? It's a game about a plumber who exists in contrast to a princess. So it's clear there is clearly an imbalance in wealth, in the kinds of archetypes that they're embodying, right? It's someone who has to work a job for a living, right? Plumbing, or a princess, a king, someone who doesn't have to work a job for a living, right? So it's different kinds of wealth, and yet Mario his whole game is about going towards this place of wealth, this princess, by accumulating coins, which often in the games end up representing life, as in Mario 64. Coins mean health, life. You grab these coins, right, and get closer and closer to this place of wealth, the monarchy, the king, the top of the pyramid. So I think like both games are kind of working within that same mentality. Both games are not both games. Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time are both from the 90s. I think that's interesting to keep in mind as well. So yeah, bunch of stuff like that, which is complicated when you introduce the theme of gender into it. Which was very interesting, right? Because there is this whole kind of like conglomerate of soup. There's this sort of soup of things touching each other. There is gender, there is sexual orientation, there is money and work, and spirit and mysticism. Kind of, it's I don't know. That's what I want to kind of focus on and try to unravel, because I feel like there is something here that's like would like to be unraveled. So let's try and see if we can do that. So I guess this video was just like a presentation of some of these themes. These are the kind of themes that I would like to look at moving on. These are the kind of themes that I'm interested in seeing whether the adult portion of Ocarina of Time really does focus on, in which way would it focus on them, and see where we go from there. So yeah, I don't know. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.